The last person to speak with Dr. Marlene Charlie on the morning of her disappearance was a hospital receptionist who had known her for nearly a decade. According to her statement, Marlene sounded distracted, but not distressed. She had called to say she'd be running late for her afternoon shift, something she almost never did. Her voice was calm, professional, apologetic. Then the line went dead. That call, brief and ordinary, would later be replayed dozens of times by investigators searching for meaning in every pause, every breath. At the time, it meant nothing. By the end of that day, it meant everything. Before moving forward into today's heartbreaking story, make sure you support the channel, like this video, leave a comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss the next true crime story just like this. Marlene Charlie was 48 years old in 2010. She was a respected internal medicine physician, the kind patients trusted instinctively. She had worked at the same regional hospital for over 15 years, building a reputation for patience, precision, and quiet empathy. Colleagues described her as steady, almost unshakable. She didn't gossip. She didn't rush. She listened. At home, she was just as consistent. Marlene had been married to her husband, Thomas, for 20 years. Their marriage was not flashy, but it was solid. They had built a life rooted in routines, shared morning coffee, weekend errands, family dinners that rarely changed day or time. Their children were grown or nearly grown, and by most outward measures, Marlene's life had entered a stable, comfortable chapter. There was no indication she planned to leave it. The day she vanished began like any other. She left the house shortly after 7 a.m., wearing a dark coat and carrying her work bag. A neighbor later recalled seeing her reverse out of the driveway slowly, as if checking her mirrors twice. There was nothing unusual about that either. Marlene was cautious by nature. But she never arrived at the hospital. By mid-afternoon, staff began calling her phone. It went straight to voicemail. Thomas assumed she had stayed late or stopped to run errands. When she still hadn't returned home by evening, worry crept in, but not panic. That came later, when her car was found. The vehicle was located just after midnight in a public parking structure less than 5 miles from her home. It was locked. There were no signs of forced entry. Her bag was gone. So was her phone. The garage's security cameras had been malfunctioning that week, capturing only fragments of footage too degraded to be useful. What investigators did find was unsettling in its absence. No blood. No struggle. No witnesses who saw her enter or leave the garage. It was as if Marlene had parked, stepped out, and simply vanished into thin air. The case quickly drew attention. A middle-aged doctor with no history of instability, no financial troubles, no known enemies, gone without a trace. Search teams canvassed nearby streets and buildings. Flyers went up. Volunteers combed wooded areas and abandoned lots. Her family pleaded publicly for information. Nothing surfaced. As weeks turned into months, investigators dug into Marlene's professional life. They reviewed patient records, appointment logs, prescription histories. Everything appeared proper. She had no disciplinary actions. No malpractice claims. No recent conflicts with patients or co-workers. Her personal life revealed just as little. There were no secret accounts, no hidden relationships, no signs she was planning a departure. Her passport remained at home. Her credit cards were untouched. Her phone was never recovered. Theories multiplied as evidence dwindled. Some suggested she had been abducted, targeted because of her profession. Others believed she may have encountered someone she trusted, someone who knew her habits. A smaller group wondered whether she had chosen to disappear, though even her closest friends dismissed that idea outright. She loved her family too much, one of them told police. She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. By the second year, the search slowed. By the third, it stalled. The case was quietly reassigned, then archived. Marlene Charlie became another unsolved name in a filing cabinet, another face fading on missing person posters bleached by sun and rain. For her family, time moved differently. Thomas kept her phone active for years, listening to the voicemail greeting she'd recorded in a hurry, as if hearing it enough times might bring her back. Holidays passed with an empty chair. Birthdays came and went without calls. Her children grew older carrying questions no one could answer. And then, 5 years later, something impossible happened. In early 2015, hundreds of miles away from where Marlene had last been seen, a man was rushed into a hospital under heavy police guard. He had been on multiple watch lists for years, wanted by both state authorities and federal agencies for a string of violent acts that had terrorized several communities. His mental instability was well documented, his behavior unpredictable, his name known in law enforcement circles nationwide. That night, however, none of that mattered. He was dying. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize him as officers lined the hallways outside the operating room. Emergency surgery became unavoidable. During the procedure, something was discovered that made the room fall silent. Embedded where it did not belong was a rigid plastic object, badly worn but unmistakable. A doctor's identification card. The card had been placed in such a way that it had caused years of internal damage. Enough to worsen the man's condition slowly, but not enough to kill him outright. It was not accidental. It was deliberate, purposeful. When the blood was cleaned away and the name finally read aloud, one of the surgeons froze. The card belonged to Dr. Marlene Charlie. Within hours, hospital administrators contacted federal authorities. Old databases were reopened. A missing person case long thought dormant surged back to life. For the first time in 5 years, investigators weren't asking where Marlene had gone. They were asking who had taken her, and why. And as they began retracing her final months, one terrifying possibility emerged. Marlene Charlie may not have disappeared because she was weak or careless, but because someone needed her alive, skilled, and silent. What she was forced to do, and for whom, would take investigators down a path far darker than anyone was prepared for. And this time, the clock was already running out. The discovery of Marlene Charlie's Dr. ID triggered a chain reaction that few within law enforcement were prepared for. Within 24 hours, the cold case file once buried beneath years of newer investigations was pulled from storage and placed back on active status. Detectives who had never worked the case before were now reading through interviews, photographs, and handwritten notes from 2010, trying to understand how a woman who vanished without a trace could suddenly resurface inside the body of one of the country's most dangerous fugitives. The patient, whose name had circulated through federal briefings for years, was known for a pattern of violent behavior tied to severe psychological instability. Publicly, authorities would later describe his actions as atrocities that destabilized entire communities. Privately, agents acknowledged something more disturbing. His crimes often involved prolonged planning, manipulation, and an ability to evade capture that bordered on calculated brilliance. What unsettled investigators most was not just that Marlene's ID was found with him, but how. Medical analysis revealed the card had been inserted during a surgical procedure years earlier. Scar tissue had formed around it gradually, indicating it had been there for a long time. Not days. Not months. Years. The placement suggested medical precision. Whoever put it there knew exactly how to cause damage without triggering immediate symptoms that would lead to discovery. This was not a mistake made in an operating room under pressure. It was a message. Federal agents flew in to interview the surgical team that made the discovery. Every detail was documented. Every image was archived. The object was handled as both medical evidence and potential communication. Someone, somewhere, had wanted this ID to be found, just not right away. When Marlene's husband, Thomas, was notified, he reportedly sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. According to agents present, his first question wasn't where the ID had been found. It was when. Because if the ID had been inside that man for years, then Marlene might have been alive for years after her disappearance. That possibility reframed everything. Investigators began reconstructing Marlene's professional history with new urgency. They reviewed patient lists not just from her final year, but from nearly a decade prior. Anyone with a history of instability, violence, or unusual behavior was flagged. One name surfaced repeatedly, not because of confirmed wrongdoing, but because of repeated emergency visits, missed follow-ups, and erratic compliance with treatment plans. The man who would later be placed on federal watch lists had crossed paths with Marlene more than once. At the time, he was just another patient struggling with mental health issues. No criminal record. No federal interest. He had presented with vague symptoms, often changing his story, often requesting specific medications. Marlene had treated him cautiously but professionally, documenting concerns and recommending referrals that were never followed through. There was no indication she feared him. But investigators now wondered if that changed later. As agents dug deeper, they discovered gaps, appointments that had been scheduled but never logged, follow-up notes missing from the system, handwritten addendums that referenced consultations outside standard hospital settings. Nothing illegal on its own. But together, it painted a picture of someone being pulled beyond her normal scope of practice. Someone being pressured. Meanwhile, the FBI worked to understand the patient's movements during the years Marlene was missing. Though he had evaded arrest, fragments of his life had surfaced in police reports, emergency room visits under false names, and anonymous tips. In several of those instances, medical intervention was required. Someone had been treating him. And whoever that was had access to advanced surgical environments, not back-alley clinics, not makeshift rooms, but places stocked with equipment, anesthesia, and trained personnel. That realization shifted the investigation dramatically. This was no longer about one violent individual acting alone. This was about infrastructure, resources, organization. As media outlets caught wind of the reopening case, public interest surged. Headlines revisited Marlene's disappearance with renewed intensity. For the first time, her face wasn't just that of a missing person, it was evidence in a federal investigation. Authorities were careful with what they released. They acknowledged the discovery of personal property connected to Marlene Charlie, but withheld details about how and where it was found. They confirmed the patient's history of mental instability and violent behavior, emphasizing that he was considered extremely dangerous. What they didn't say was that the man had died shortly after surgery, taking with him any chance of direct answers. Whatever he knew, whatever he might have revealed, was gone. That loss hit investigators hard. With the patient deceased, the focus turned entirely to the network around him. Financial records were examined. Supply chains traced. Medical equipment shipments flagged. One international medical relief organization began appearing in places it shouldn't, remote clinics, temporary facilities, regions that coincided eerily with the patient's movements. On paper, the organization was legitimate, charitable, well-funded, publicly praised. Behind closed doors, agents couldn't explain why so many controlled substances and surgical tools were being routed through its channels without proper documentation. At the same time, Thomas received something he hadn't in years. A phone call. The number was blocked. The voice on the line was distorted, mechanical, almost artificial. The message was brief. "Stop looking. You won't like what you find." The call lasted 7 seconds. It was enough. From that moment on, federal protection was quietly extended to Marlene's family. Investigators no longer treated the case as a historical mystery, but as an active threat. Someone was watching. Someone knew the case had been reopened. And someone was nervous. As agents prepared to execute warrants and subpoena records tied to the suspicious medical organization, one final discovery emerged from the surgical analysis. Something so precise, so intentional, it reframed the ID not just as evidence, but as a countdown. Because the way it had been placed suggested Marlene hadn't just been trying to leave a clue. She had been trying to buy time. And whatever she was trying to stop might not be over yet. The final phase of the investigation unfolded quietly, away from cameras and press briefings. After the warning call to Thomas, authorities stopped treating Marlene Charlie's disappearance as a closed historical mystery and began handling it as an ongoing operation with living consequences. Forensic specialists returned to the surgical images again and again. What initially looked like an act of desperation began to resemble something far more calculated. The placement of the ID was not random, nor purely symbolic. It had been embedded near tissue that would predictably inflame over time, worsening the patient's condition slowly and inevitably. Any competent surgeon reviewing the images could see it. Marlene had known exactly what she was doing. More chilling was what the placement avoided. No major arteries. No vital organs that would cause sudden death. The ID had been positioned to ensure the patient survived long enough to eventually require emergency intervention. Likely at a legitimate hospital, under the care of surgeons who would follow protocol, document everything, and report anomalies. In other words, she had engineered discovery. Investigators now believed Marlene hadn't been trying to escape. She had been trying to communicate. As analysts cross-referenced shipment logs, travel records, and internal reports, a disturbing pattern emerged. The international medical organization that had raised early suspicions appeared repeatedly in regions where the wanted patient had resurfaced. Each time, there were gaps. Temporary clinics that existed on paper for weeks, then vanished. Medical supply deliveries that exceeded declared needs. Staff lists that changed abruptly, with names that could not be verified. Yet nothing rose to the level of a chargeable offense. The organization's leadership denied wrongdoing and welcomed audits. Their facilities were clean. Their documentation was thorough, too thorough. Every question investigators asked seemed to have been anticipated years in advance. Behind closed doors, agents acknowledged what they were facing. Not a reckless criminal operation, but a disciplined, compartmentalized network designed to survive scrutiny. And somewhere within it, Marlene Charlie had disappeared. Psychological profilers revisited Marlene's case with fresh eyes. They studied her career, her patient interactions, her refusal to cut corners. One conclusion stood out: if she had been forced into cooperation, it would not have been through money or ideology. It would have been through obligation, through threat, through someone else's life held in balance. When investigators re-examined Marlene's final months, they noticed a subtle change. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious enough to alarm those around her. She had taken on additional consultations. She had attended off-site medical reviews that weren't part of her usual routine. She had asked discreet questions about anesthesia protocols outside her specialty. Not questions of curiosity. Questions of preparation. The prevailing theory became increasingly grim. Marlene had been identified for her skills, her ethics, and her predictability. Someone had known she would comply if compliance meant preventing immediate harm, and that she would resist just enough to leave a trace if given the slightest opportunity. That opportunity came during surgery. The FBI wanted patients' mental instability, once seen as the primary threat, now appeared secondary. He was volatile, violent, unpredictable, but he was also being used, transported, treated, kept alive far longer than his condition should have allowed. He was a vessel. And Marlene's ID was the only message she could send. Despite months of intensified investigation, no warrants led to arrests. No witnesses came forward. The suspicious organization adjusted its operations, scaled back visible activity, and continued functioning within the law. Every lead dissolved just before it could solidify. Then, without explanation, the pressure eased. Resources were reassigned. Task forces disbanded. Officials cited a lack of actionable evidence. Publicly, the case slipped back into silence, this time carrying the weight of what might have been uncovered, but never proven. Thomas received no further calls. No demands. No threats. Just absence. Years later, Marlene Charlie's case remains unresolved. Officially, she is still listed as missing. Unofficially, many who worked the investigation believe she survived for years after 2010, operating under coercion, moving between controlled environments, leaving behind nothing but a single, deliberate clue hidden where only chance and time could uncover it. There is no grave, no remains, no final confirmation. Only a doctor's ID card, recovered from a man the world feared, bearing the name of a woman who refused to disappear without telling the truth, even if the truth arrived 5 years too late. And somewhere, beyond records and reach, the question still lingers. Was Marlene Charlie silenced before she could speak again? Or is the reason no one ever found her because she made sure they wouldn't, until it was absolutely necessary? To this day, no one can say for certain. And that may have been exactly what she intended. Do you believe Marlene Charlie was trying to send a message before she disappeared? Or was her Dr. ID discovered exactly the way someone else planned it to be found? Was she forced to work in the shadows for years? Or did she manage to outsmart the people who took her, leaving behind the only clue she could? And if that ID was a warning, who was it really meant for? Let me know what you think actually happened in the comments below. Your theories matter more than you realize. If you enjoy deep, unsettling stories like this one, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who loves true crime. Your support helps keep these stories alive and keeps the search for answers going.